Good evening, night owls, and welcome back to Sleepless Politics, the channel where the hour is late, the coffee is bitter, and the truth we dig up is older than the official records will ever admit. Tonight's story doesn't come from crime novels, spy films, or conspiracy chat rooms. No, this one is carved straight out of the history textbooks they never let you read too closely. It's a story with the scent of old oil, dusty banknotes, false headlines, and a city that woke up one morning and realized its democracy was taken from under its feet, quietly, professionally, by people who didn't even live there. This is not just a strange story. It's unnerving because it's real. It happened in broad daylight, but designed at night by men who never left fingerprints on the decisions they authored. Tonight, we're stepping into a world where a government was toppled like a house of cards, not by an army crossing its borders, not by angry citizens storming parliament, but by a handful of foreign operatives with too much money, too many newspapers in their pockets, and a single goal: protect the oil beneath someone else's soil. But before we peel back the curtains on this operation, I want one thing from you. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time of night you're still awake. Every time you do, it maps out our little community of wide-eyed night thinkers, insomniacs of history, people who know that the truth sleeps less than we do. Some stories are too important to hear in daylight. Some stories demand darkness because they were born in it. So settle in, dim the lights, steady your mind. Because the tale we're entering tonight didn't just change a country. It shifted the global balance of who controls power, who profits from the ground beneath our feet, and who gets to decide which leaders live or fall. It's a story where the CIA and the MI6 worked hand in glove like thieves in a market at midnight, where newspapers turned into weapons, mobs were rented like stage actors, and generals were bought like luxury goods. A country's future, its democracy, its pride, all priced, negotiated, and sold. This is the story of Iran in 1953, and the day a man named Mohammad Mossadegh, elected by his people, dared to do something unthinkable. He nationalized Iranian oil. He said that if oil came from Iran, it should enrich Iran, not foreign companies, not imperial remnants, not Western shareholders who dined continents away from the land they extracted. Sounds simple, right? Fair? Popular? That's exactly why it terrified the powerful. Because a fair idea, in the wrong place, can become more dangerous than any weapon. What followed was an operation the world did not see coming. A covert plan whispered about in nameless offices, funded with secret budgets, executed with staged protests, fake headlines, and stacks of cash passed into trembling hands. Newspapers printed lies on command. Politicians flipped overnight. Streets were flooded with actors who pretended to riot. And somewhere in the middle of Tehran, the future of an entire nation was being rewritten anonymously. They called it Operation Ajax. The documents said it never happened. The evidence was destroyed, denied, buried, forgotten, until it resurfaced decades later like a message in a bottle that shouldn't have survived the waves. No spoilers, no shortcuts, just a slow, unsettling descent into how a democracy was dismantled, not with bullets first, but with headlines, bribes, and a plan so quiet that the victim didn't realize what had happened until it was already over. Tonight, we unravel how a country lost its leader to a plot designed in Washington and London. Tonight, we uncover the coup that officially never happened. Mohammad Mossadegh was not the kind of leader foreign powers expected to fear. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a fiery populist shouting from balconies. He was a thin, pale aristocrat who frequently worked from his bed because of chronic illness and wore pajamas while reading stacks of legal documents. And yet, somehow, this frail, elderly intellectual became the most dangerous man in the Middle East to two empires who had grown far too comfortable extracting Iranian wealth. Mossadegh had spent decades studying law across Europe, immersing himself in constitutional theory and the rights of nations to their own resources. The more he learned, the clearer it became. Iran was rich, but Iranians were not. British-run oil fields turned unimaginable profits. Oil that ran Royal Navy fleets, built British infrastructure, fueled the post-war recovery, while Iran received scraps, barely enough to develop its own schools or hospitals. In Abadan, tens of thousands of Iranian workers labored under brutal heat for low wages, and British managers lived in air-conditioned neighborhoods with lawns and swimming pools. The resentment wasn't subtle. It simmered in the dust and fumes of the refinery, in newspapers, in parliamentary debates, in dinner conversations where young men discussed the idea of dignity. By 1951, ordinary Iranians weren't just angry, they were restless. Britain's Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, AIOC, later known as BP, controlled Iranian oil like a landlord controls a tenant's home. The company dictated prices, paid minimal royalties, and refused transparency. Iran couldn't even audit its own oil revenues. It was theft dressed in contracts. Mossadegh understood that this wasn't just economic injustice, it was political bondage. Sovereignty without control of resources was a performance, not freedom. When Mossadegh introduced the bill to nationalize oil, he didn't do it as a firebrand, he did it as a lawyer, calm, meticulous, unshakable. He invoked legal precedent, public morality, national sovereignty, and the simple principle that Iranian oil belonged to the Iranian people. The parliament voted overwhelmingly in favor. The crowds outside erupted into tears and cheers. For the first time in decades, Iranians felt they had managed to pull something back from imperial hands. Newspapers celebrated him as a patriot. Students marched. Workers held up his portrait in Abadan. He became prime minister not because he sought power, but because the public demanded a leader who would defend their rights. Across the world, in polished conference rooms in London, the reaction was panic, disguised as civility. AIOC executives warned the British government that losing Iranian oil would cripple Britain's global power and its ability to recover from World War II. They painted Mossadegh not as a nationalist, but as a threat. Reckless, unstable, a danger to world markets. The British political class, still addicted to colonial entitlement, treated nationalization as theft. How dare Iran take its own oil without permission? Diplomacy was tried, but with a condescending tone. Britain demanded control, demanded access, demanded that Iran reverse course. Mossadegh refused, politely but firmly. That refusal was the moment the British realized they weren't negotiating with a puppet. They were negotiating with the men who wouldn't bow. And men who do not bow become enemies. Britain launched an embargo, froze Iranian assets, and blocked tankers from shipping oil. They hoped to starve Iran into submission, to make Mossadegh unpopular, to turn the public against him. But this only deepened Iranian unity. Even opponents respected him for defending national dignity. Europe watched carefully. If Iran succeeded, other countries might nationalize their own resources. The British Empire felt something it hadn't felt often: vulnerability. It was at this point, as oil wells slowed, as refineries stood still, as Britain tightened its grip, that a second foreign power began to pay attention. Not because of oil alone, but because of fear. A new, cold fear. Not fear of nationalism, but of communism. The United States of America was watching.
In London, frustration hardened into strategy. Mossadegh had proven immune to diplomatic pressure, immune to embargoes, immune to condescension. The British Foreign Office, still believing Iran was a place to be managed rather than respected, turned to its darker toolkit. If economic pressure couldn't break Mossadegh, perhaps misinformation and destabilization could. Quietly, discreetly, MI6 was given permission to act. But there was a problem. Iran suspected British manipulation. Mossadegh, always cautious, knew the British Empire was infamous for engineering coups behind closed curtains. He didn't underestimate them. Within months of the oil nationalization, Britain's entire diplomatic mission in Tehran was compromised. Iranian intelligence had grown paranoid, intercepting communications and tracking peculiar meetings. Mossadegh took a bold step. He expelled all British embassy personnel from Iran. Overnight, diplomats, engineers, and intelligence officers were herded out under government orders. The British embassy, a hub of political influence for decades, became an empty shell. MI6 found itself blind. Without agents on the ground, the British could not bribe newspapers, fund mobs, or recruit military officers. Mossadegh had effectively cut the empire's fingers off at the wrist. But that didn't mean Britain gave up. It simply changed tactics. MI6 began to run its destabilization from afar, using contacts in neighboring Iraq and undercover operatives in Cyprus. They funneled money into Iranian newspapers willing to publish anti-Mossadegh rhetoric. False reports began to circulate internationally, framing Mossadegh as mentally unstable, weak, and leaning toward communism. The British understood something fundamental. If they couldn't control Iran from inside, they could destroy its reputation from outside. The first campaign attacked Mossadegh's health, painting him as erratic, emotional, unfit for leadership. Western journalists were fed stories that portrayed him as a hysterical, pajama-clad fanatic. Reports claimed he wept uncontrollably, fainted often, and governed under mental breakdowns. This caricature was not harmless propaganda. It was designed to undermine Mossadegh's credibility among global investors and politicians, to make Iran look like a nation run by a madman. The second campaign painted Iran as a gateway for Soviet expansion. Mossadegh had allies among Iran's broad political spectrum, including members of Tudeh, Iran's Communist Party. He tolerated them legally, though he never embraced their ideology. MI6 inflated that association into a looming threat. Iran will fall to the USSR, the rumors whispered. Nationalization is a mask for communist takeover. In the early 1950s world, that idea was poison, especially to Washington. Britain needed the United States, but President Harry Truman was skeptical. He distrusted old imperial games and saw nationalism as a legitimate movement, not a communist foothold. Mossadegh, to Truman, was a Democrat protecting his country's resources. The British argument that nationalization was dangerous socialism was unconvincing. So MI6 intensified its narrative. It funded rallies that would appear chaotic enough to mimic radical unrest. It paid individuals to stir violence, hoping to provoke clashes Mossadegh would have to suppress, thus portraying him as authoritarian. But Mossadegh, cautious and legally minded, refused to respond brutally. He believed force corrupted democracies. Ironically, his commitment to civil rights and restraint made him appear weak to outside observers. Still, despite sabotage, embargoes, and smear campaigns, Mossadegh remained popular. His face appeared in bazaars, on banners, in university halls. Crowds continued to chant his name. In Tehran's narrow streets, he was the symbol of a long-denied dignity. British efforts had slowed Iran's economy, but not its pride. Mossadegh's refusal to bow only strengthened public support. Britain grew desperate. They needed something bigger, something beyond propaganda and street agitation. They needed a partner who feared communism enough to intervene. And they finally realized who that partner was. Across the Atlantic, a new administration was rising. Dwight Eisenhower was entering the White House, carrying with him a cabinet of hawks
convinced that the Cold War demanded decisive, secret victories. Britain saw their moment. If they could convince the new American government that Iran was at risk of going red, then America would do what Britain could not do alone: overthrow Mossadegh. The stage was set for a meeting that would change history.
When Dwight D. Eisenhower entered the Oval Office in January 1953, the Cold War dominated every breath of Washington. Government agencies whispered about Soviet influence like priests murmuring about sin. The Korean War had hardened America's worldview into a sharp, unyielding binary. Nations were either with the United States or destined to collapse into the red shadow of Moscow. It was within this tense atmosphere that Britain saw its opening. MI6 officials framed Iran's struggle not as a battle over oil, but as one over ideological conquest. They brought intelligence assessments to Washington that dripped with anxiety. Mossadegh was letting communists roam freely. Tudeh party influence was growing. Iran's weakened economy after the embargo might push it into the arms of the USSR. They pushed a story carefully crafted to appeal to American paranoia. They spoke less about oil royalties and more about containment theory, the belief that if one country tilted toward communism, its region would crumble in a domino effect. Suddenly, Iranian oil wasn't just about wealth. It was about global strategy. The Truman administration had been cautious, skeptical of fighting Britain's colonial battles for them, but Eisenhower's new team was different. His Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, believed the Cold War would be won not by armies alone, but by covert strategies, hidden hands shaping governments from the shadows. His brother, Allen Dulles, had just taken charge of the CIA. Together, they represented a new era of American foreign policy, one where coups could be bought, leaders could be replaced, and democracies that dared to claim their sovereignty could be corrected with deniable force. Britain presented Mossadegh as a dangerous gamble, but they were careful not to show their imperial frustration too clearly. They let American officials conclude on their own that Iran could not be allowed to fall under any influence that was not Western. In truth, Mossadegh was no communist. He distrusted both Soviet and Western domination. But in the Cold War, nuance was a luxury no one wanted to afford. And so MI6 offered a partnership. They had the digital footprint of the Middle East, the networks, the contacts, the propaganda channels. The CIA had the money, the global cover, and the political momentum. Together, they could perform a surgical overthrow, a non-military solution, one that could be denied forever, one that would not leave American fingerprints on the street. Thus began Operation Ajax. The plan was deceptively simple: make Iran ungovernable. If Mossadegh could be portrayed as the cause of chaos, not the victim of sabotage, then his allies in parliament, the clergy, the military, and the streets would lose confidence. The coup would not appear as a foreign intervention. It would look like a domestic correction. The CIA appointed a charismatic fixer to lead the operation, Kermit Roosevelt Jr., grandson of U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt. He was polished, educated, persuasive, fluent in Middle Eastern politics, and utterly convinced that toppling Mossadegh would save Iran from communism. That belief gave him justification, even righteousness. Roosevelt arrived quietly in Tehran, posing as an oil consultant. Beneath his calm smile lay a scheme meant to turn the city into a theater of controlled chaos. He carried bags of money to fund mobs, newspapers, politicians, and anyone willing to undermine the government. MI6 would supply valuable networks, and the CIA would activate them like pieces on the chessboard. It wasn't war, it was choreography. Washington approved a budget of $1 million, worth over $10 million today, to destabilize a democracy.
Meanwhile, Mossadegh still believed he was negotiating with rational adversaries. He never imagined that the world's leading democracy had decided to crush his own. He thought the Americans might mediate fairly, that they were different from the British imperialists he had expelled. That tragic assumption would lead him blindfolded into the trap. Roosevelt, meanwhile, began planning the sequence of events that would break Iran from within. It would start slowly, invisibly, like a storm forming beyond distant mountains. Soon, the first paid protesters would fill the streets, and Mossadegh would mistake them for his people.
The first step of Operation Ajax did not involve tanks or generals. It involved paper, ink, voices, and money. Before you overthrow a government, you must overthrow its image. You must make its supporters doubt, its rivals embolden, and its neutrals uncomfortable. Mossadegh's greatest strength had been the belief that he represented the will of the people. So the CIA and MI6 aimed for that belief first. Kermit Roosevelt and British operative Norman Derbyshire began buying influence the way a merchant buys spices. Tehran's newspapers became marketplaces for loyalty. Editors who previously waved Mossadegh's photo proudly now published stories calling him unstable, dictatorial, or, the favorite accusation, sympathetic to communism. Some journalists resisted. Some demanded more money. Others accepted payment eagerly, discovering that foreign cash smelled no different than Iranian rial. Articles spoke with deliberate rhythm. Mossadegh was failing the nation. Mossadegh was bankrupting the economy. Mossadegh was inviting Soviet control. Mossadegh was the threat. The goal wasn't to prove anything. It was simply to repeat it until repetition became memory, and memory became truth. Next came the streets. Roosevelt met with a network of shady figures, smugglers, strongmen, gang leaders, and street agitators whose loyalty could be rented by the day. The CIA paid them to form crowds, march, chant, and sometimes fight. Their job was to simulate public rage. They would protest Mossadegh in the morning as patriotic nationalists, then switch signs and chant for Mossadegh in the afternoon as radical communists, causing ordinary Iranians to see chaos everywhere and blame the government for losing control. In 1 week, Tehran felt like a city unraveling. Crowds clashed with police, shops closed, rumors of strikes circulated. Each act of disorder became proof of Mossadegh's weakness, and newspapers, conveniently, wrote about growing public fury, never revealing the CIA wallets hidden behind every banner. But Roosevelt and MI6 understood something crucial about Iran. Mobs could shake the ground, but clerics could shake the soul. Mosques had always been a pillar of public opinion. If imams preached against Mossadegh, the people would listen, but the clergy was divided. Some saw Mossadegh as a patriot, others feared the two-day party's growing presence. The CIA exploited that fear. Religious leaders were approached discreetly. Some were promised money. Others were promised protection against communism. Others were told Mossadegh had secret secular ambitions. One particular cleric, Ayatollah Kashani, had once been Mossadegh's ally. He was respected, influential, and popular among bazaar merchants. Roosevelt's agents encouraged posters and rumors suggesting Mossadegh planned to diminish Islamic courts and release leftist prisoners. Kashani began to drift away publicly. The CIA didn't need him to support the coup. They just needed him to stop defending Mossadegh. Silence was enough. Mossadegh watched the chaos unfold with confusion, not cunning. He saw protests, read hostile articles, witnessed clerical tension, but remained convinced that open debate, even furious debate, was the sign of a healthy society. He believed rights should not be crushed, even when they were used against him. His legalistic mind clung to democratic principles, even as those principles were weaponized to strangle him. Meanwhile, ordinary Iranians felt trapped in contradictory stories. Prices were rising due to the embargo. The government seemed unable to fix it. Newspapers screamed about communism. Protesters marched in circles. Some people still supported Mossadegh. Some blamed him. Most were exhausted. And exhaustion is fertile soil for manipulation. Behind the confusion, behind each staged riot and planted editorial, Roosevelt and MI6 smiled quietly because Iran's reality was beginning to blur. And when reality blurs, people stop defending leaders and start searching for saviors. Next came the military. Because after you break a country's confidence, you go after its guns. While the streets howled with bought voices and newspapers printed purchased truths, the coup's architects prepared for their most delicate task, turning soldiers against their own government. Armies do not topple leaders because they disagree with them. They topple leaders when someone whispers that the future is safer without them. And safety, in this case, would be purchased in US dollars and British pounds. The Iranian military, like many institutions in the country, was built on hierarchy and loyalty to the monarchy. The Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, technically commanded the armed forces, but the Shah was young, cautious, and easily intimidated by powerful statesmen. Mossadegh had earned significant military authority as well, though he used it sparingly. Roosevelt understood that the key to the coup wasn't to control the entire army. All he needed were a few ambitious officers willing to betray at the right moment. MI6 provided a list of possible collaborators: generals, colonels, police chiefs, even lower-ranking officers who displayed resentment toward Mossadegh. Many senior officials felt humiliated that an elderly civilian leader, prone to tears and legal lectures, could undermine military privilege. Others feared that his tolerance of two-day activists could eventually shrink their influence. Still others were simply corrupt. Years of British presence had normalized bribery within the state. Roosevelt began meeting with officers secretly in safe houses and hotel rooms. He arrived with confidence and envelopes thick with money. The CIA offered not just immediate cash, but promises, future positions, promotions under a restored government, and personal protection if things went wrong. Some officers resisted, some hesitated, but power has a way of persuading those who believe they deserve it. Slowly, quietly, key names were purchased. General Fazlallah Zahedi, a stern and ambitious man, became the centerpiece of the coup. He would replace Mossadegh after the overthrow. Zahedi accepted both money and the illusion of patriotism, telling himself that removing Mossadegh would save the country from disorder and communism. Below him, other officers were recruited. Some agreed out of greed, others out of rivalry, some out of fear that if they didn't join, they would be on the wrong side when the dust settled. The structure of betrayal took shape like scaffolding, and all it needed was a nudge to collapse the government. The Shah, meanwhile, remained trapped between two titanic forces: Mossadegh, the elected leader loved by the people, and the Americans and British, who held international power and whispered promises of stability. Roosevelt knew the Shah's hesitancy was a liability, so the CIA pressured him using both psychological manipulation and diplomatic intimidation. They told him Iran was collapsing, that communism loomed, and that history would blame him if he didn't act. They sent envoys to gently suggest that America could not protect him if the Soviets ever took power. They implied that constitutional monarchy itself was at risk. The Shah began to waver. Yet Mossadegh still believed he could win legally. He underestimated how deeply his enemies had penetrated the military. He believed the army remained loyal because it was bound by law. He trusted institutions more than men, and that trust would cost him. As the CIA secured military allies, they also prepared the mechanism that would make the coup appear legitimate. Instead of tanks storming parliament without justification, the Shah would sign two decrees: one dismissing Mossadegh as prime minister,
and another appointing General Zahedi in his place. Even though the Iranian constitution gave Mossadegh the right to resist, the symbolism of royal dismissal was powerful. It provided a legal facade. The coup would look like obedience to monarchy rather than foreign intrusion. But the plan needed speed. Every day risked exposure. Mossadegh was still popular. The streets were still unpredictable. A wrong move could backfire. Everything was ready. The propaganda, the mobs, the clergy's silence, the military betrayal, and the reluctant monarch. Now all that remained was execution. The date was set. Tehran's fate would unfold under a scorching August sun.
The first blow against Mossadegh was scheduled for the night of August 15, 1953. The plan was deceptively straightforward. The Shah would sign the royal decrees dismissing Mossadegh and naming Zahedi prime minister. Then a secret group of military units, loyal to the CIA, would arrive at Mossadegh's home in the dead of night, arrest him quietly, and bring him before the new government. Iran would wake up to a new leader already sworn in, and the coup would appear as a smooth transfer of power orchestrated by the monarch. That was the theory. Reality, however, had its own script. Mossadegh, though trusting in legal frameworks, was not naive about threats. He knew foreign pressure was growing. He suspected British agents even after their expulsion. He understood that the military was the most vulnerable institution to manipulation. For weeks, he had quietly been rotating officers, replacing those who seemed too aligned with foreign influence. He had quietly ordered loyalists to monitor suspicious movements. He still believed in the law, but he didn't ignore danger. As the night of August 15th arrived, a small column of trucks filled with soldiers rolled through Tehran's streets toward Mossadegh's residence. Their orders were clear. They were executing the Shah's decree. They expected loyalty. They expected surprise. They expected obedience from a sleepy guard detail. Instead, they found Mossadegh waiting. Loyal officers had tipped him off. His house was fortified. His guards were ready. When the rogue column arrived, they were confronted not with panic, but with armed resistance. Some soldiers hesitated, unsure whether to follow their orders or surrender to a prime minister who still legally held office. Chaos erupted. Shots rang out. The arrest attempt crumbled in minutes. The coup, meant to be invisible, became loudly visible and embarrassingly clumsy. The officers involved were arrested. The Shah's signed decrees were discovered on one of the coup leaders, exposing the monarch's betrayal. Mossadegh immediately broadcast a message to the nation announcing that an illegal plot had been thwarted. Crowds poured into the streets in support of the prime minister, chanting his name, waving flags, condemning traitors. For a moment, it seemed Mossadegh's commitment to democracy had triumphed over shadowy foreign intrigue. The Shah panicked. Terrified of retaliation, he fled Iran, rushing onto a plane bound first to Baghdad, then Rome. In Tehran, news of his escape spread like wildfire. Many Iranians celebrated his departure. They assumed Mossadegh would now consolidate power and push forward with nationalization without the monarchy's interference. In the euphoria of the failed coup, some believed Iran had finally broken free from imperial influence forever. And in Washington and London, there was shock, even panic. For the first time, a CIA-backed coup had failed publicly. Eisenhower's administration was humiliated. MI6 was furious. Panic turned to blame. Some said the plan lacked force. Some argued they should have relied heavily on the army. Others claimed Mossadegh had proven himself a dangerous genius rather than a frail, sentimental patriot. The coup appeared not only a failure, but a disaster that strengthened Mossadegh. Yet, beneath the celebrations lay a fatal misinterpretation. Mossadegh believed the coup was over. He assumed the attempt was the full effort of his enemies. He did not realize it was only Act 1. Kermit Roosevelt saw something radically different. He saw that Mossadegh had shown his hand too soon.
He had mobilized supporters, he had exposed the Shah's involvement, he had arrested officers, he had declared victory. But victory creates expectation, and expectation creates vulnerability. The CIA smelled opportunity in the very thing Mossadegh believed was his triumph. The streets had erupted spontaneously in support of Mossadegh. Roosevelt realized that if they could erupt for him, they could erupt against him too, if manipulated properly. He sent coded messages to Washington and London. The operation is not over. Give me 3 more days. He was granted full authority. And now, instead of a secret arrest, the CIA would reach for a more brutal strategy. Not stealth, chaos.
After the failed August 15 coup, Tehran simmered with optimism. Mossadegh appeared untouchable. The Shah had fled, and the streets were alive with supporters waving banners celebrating Iran's sovereignty. Yet, in the quiet back rooms of hotels and safe houses, Kermit Roosevelt and his CIA team were calculating a far more dangerous course. They had learned a lesson. Stealth alone had failed. Now, chaos would be their instrument. The plan was audacious. If the people themselves could be turned against Mossadegh, if the streets could erupt not in support but in fear and confusion, then the government's legitimacy would crumble from within. Roosevelt's team worked to orchestrate simultaneous incidents across Tehran. Staged protests, fake attacks, and carefully timed confrontations designed to make it seem as though Mossadegh had lost control of the city. Money flowed again into crowds, clerics were persuaded to denounce him from pulpits, and newspapers printed alarming stories about looming civil war. This time, the operation wasn't subtle. It was overwhelming. On August 19, the city began to fracture. CIA-funded mobs clashed with Mossadegh's supporters in a series of orchestrated street battles. Small groups attacked shops and offices loyal to the prime minister, shouting slogans of anger and fear. Others posed as pro-communist agitators, adding to the confusion. Citizens could no longer distinguish friend from enemy, and rumors spread faster than any actual fighting. That Mossadegh's government was corrupt, that he intended to exile the Shah permanently, that Soviet agents were embedded in every ministry. Chaos became a weapon. At the same time, Roosevelt's team worked to manipulate the clergy further. Ayatollah Kashani, who had previously remained cautious, was pressured into issuing sermons condemning Mossadegh's supposed authoritarianism. The language was subtle, but powerful. He warned the faithful that their nation teetered on the edge, that democracy had limits when the streets burned, and that salvation might require new leadership. For ordinary Iranians, these sermons were deeply convincing, a moral seal on what appeared to be widespread unrest. Behind the scenes, the CIA contacted sympathetic military officers, reminding them of their earlier promises: power, protection, and advancement. Many officers who had hesitated during the first attempt now agreed that action was necessary. Some were motivated by patriotism, others by greed, still others by fear of the angered mob spilling into barracks and neighborhoods. Zahedi and his collaborators quietly coordinated troop movements. Tanks and armored cars were positioned strategically, prepared for rapid intervention if street violence escalated further. Meanwhile, the Shah was maneuvered back into the plot. Roosevelt and MI6 agents reached out to him in Rome, painting a dire picture. Tehran was descending into lawlessness. Mossadegh's popularity was fragile, and the longer he stayed away, the more likely a communist takeover would succeed. The Shah, long hesitant, signed the necessary decrees again, this time under far greater American pressure. His signature provided the legal veneer needed for a constitutional transition of power. By August 19th evening, the streets were ready.
Pro-Mossadegh supporters clashed with CIA-funded mobs in explosions of violence in key neighborhoods. Shops and offices were looted, strategically targeted to send the illusion of widespread unrest. The press amplified every incident, turning rumors into fact and fear into a narrative of inevitable collapse. For many citizens, it seemed as though the country itself was unraveling. Mossadegh, exhausted and physically fragile, attempted to maintain order. He issued statements urging calm and restraint, but these messages were drowned out by the noise of the orchestrated chaos. Loyal troops hesitated, unsure whether to suppress crowds violently or risk being seen as traitors. Soldiers who had secretly aligned with Zahedi and the CIA quietly began to pivot. The balance of loyalty began tipping. By the night's end, Roosevelt's gamble had succeeded. Streets that had celebrated Mossadegh now teetered on the edge of revolt. Public perception had shifted. The prime minister, once untouchable, appeared vulnerable, indecisive, and isolated. All the pieces, the moneyed mobs, the pressured clergy, and the compromised military, and the manipulated press, converged perfectly. Operation Ajax was no longer a single failed coup. It was a carefully orchestrated campaign of psychological warfare and urban chaos. As the first light of August 20th broke over Tehran, the stage was set for Mossadegh's ultimate removal. The prime minister's enemies had learned something crucial. Victory was possible not by overt force alone, but by making the people, the streets, and even the loyalists believe that the nation itself had turned against its leader. And with that belief planted, the final act of Operation Ajax would begin.
The morning of August 20, 1953, began with a tense stillness over Tehran, the kind of silence that always precedes disaster. Mossadegh, weakened by stress and illness, rose early, unaware that the culmination of weeks of foreign orchestration and domestic betrayal was about to strike. Loyalists had been shaken by the previous night's chaos. Rumors of attacks on government buildings, clerical denunciations, and street violence had spread through the army, paralyzing those who might have acted to protect him. Confidence was eroding as carefully orchestrated propaganda and street theatrics made it seem that Iran itself was turning against its prime minister. The first major movement came from the military. Units that had once hesitated now advanced under Zahedi's command. Tanks rolled into key intersections. Armored vehicles blocked entrances to Mossadegh's home and parliament. Soldiers, many of whom had received secret payments from the CIA, were told that the Shah had ordered the prime minister's removal. They were presented with legal papers, decrees signed by Mohammad Reza Pahlavi himself, and assurances that the United States and Britain supported the transition. For hesitant officers, the combination of authority and foreign backing was irresistible. Obedience replaced doubt. Mossadegh attempted to resist. He read aloud from the Constitution, asserting that only the parliament could remove a prime minister and that the Shah's decrees were unlawful. He summoned ministers, lawyers, and loyal troops to advise him. But each step of resistance played into the coup's design. The CIA and MI6 had ensured that every loyalist had been pressured, bribed, or intimidated. When soldiers hesitated outside his residence, they were ordered to fire if necessary, a threat enough to convince many to step aside. Mossadegh was increasingly isolated. By late morning, the situation had deteriorated into chaos. The streets were filled with both supporters and paid protesters, fighting each other in orchestrated clashes that left bystanders confused. News outlets, controlled or influenced by foreign operatives, reported that the prime minister's government had collapsed under popular unrest. Clerics delivered sermons framing Mossadegh as a failed leader, further undermining public morale.
Citizens who had celebrated him days earlier now feared violence and instability. Amid this confusion, Mossadegh's loyal troops faltered. Officers who had once defended him defected to Zahidi's side. Barracks that should have been bastions of loyalty became staging grounds for the coup's forces. The carefully planned orchestration of urban chaos created an impression that Mossadegh's government had lost control entirely, and the population, conditioned by a week of manipulated perceptions, largely believed it. At approximately noon, the coup reached its critical moment. A detachment of military police, under Zahidi's authority, entered Mossadegh's residence. He was surrounded, given an ultimatum, and, despite his protests and appeals to law and legitimacy, was arrested. The arrest was executed efficiently, not violently, but decisively. Mossadegh was taken to a secure location under house arrest, while the Shah's decrees were read publicly, naming Zahidi as the new prime minister. The transition appeared legal and authoritative, a domestic correction rather than a foreign-engineered coup. Within hours, the streets were filled with rumors of Mossadegh's capture. Newspapers, which had been carefully manipulated in the preceding days, reported his dismissal as a constitutional necessity. Clerics, influenced by prior persuasion, spoke of national salvation and stability. Even some ordinary citizens, exhausted by confusion and street chaos, accepted the narrative. The public, convinced that the tide had turned, largely did not resist. The CIA and MI6 had succeeded in making reality itself a weapon against Mossadegh. For Mossadegh, the fall was sudden and crushing. In the span of a week, the combination of propaganda, paid mobs, clerical influence, military betrayal, and the Shah's complicity had undone decades of legal and political work. His dream of an independent Iran, enriched by its own oil and free from foreign domination, had been dismantled not with foreign tanks, but with a carefully orchestrated combination of fear, confusion, and manipulation. The Shah returned shortly after the coup, emboldened and secure under the protection of foreign powers. Zahidi, installed as prime minister, quickly moved to consolidate control, ensuring that Mossadegh's supporters were sidelined or neutralized. The oil companies, once nationalized, were slowly returned to Western control under new agreements favorable to the United States and Britain. Operation Ajax, officially denied for decades, had succeeded in achieving its goals. Iran was back under influence, its democratic experiment crushed, and the Cold War narrative of containment reaffirmed. Mossadegh would survive politically, but only as a symbol. He was placed under house arrest for the remainder of his life, forbidden from public office, a quiet reminder of the cost of defying global powers. Meanwhile, the CIA and MI6 celebrated what they portrayed internally as one of the first successful covert coups of the Cold War, a model of psychological warfare, manipulation, and deniable intervention that would shape U.S. foreign policy for decades to come. The streets of Tehran had been bought, newspapers had been corrupted, generals had been bribed, and a nation had been manipulated into submission. And yet, the story of Operation Ajax would not remain secret forever. It would haunt history, inform distrust, and cast a shadow over U.S.-Iranian relations for generations. The consequences of this engineered chaos reached far beyond the immediate overthrow, creating ripple effects that would shape not only Iran's fate, but global geopolitics for decades. The dust had barely settled over Tehran when the consequences of Operation Ajax began to unfold in full. At first glance, the coup appeared clean, almost surgical. Mossadegh was removed,
Zahedi was installed, and the Shah, restored and emboldened, projected an image of unshakable authority. Yet beneath the surface, the country was fragile, politically fractured, and simmering with resentment. The overthrow of a democratically elected leader was more than a single event. It became the seed of long-term instability, distrust, and a bitter legacy that would define Iran's relationship with the West for decades. Oil, the original spark of the conflict, quickly shifted back into Western hands. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which had been nationalized in 1951, was restructured under agreements favorable to Britain and the United States. The terms ensured that a substantial portion of Iran's oil revenue would continue to flow abroad, reversing the economic sovereignty Mossadegh had fought to achieve. Iranian nationalists felt betrayed. To many citizens, the legal maneuvers and foreign-funded chaos that had toppled their government represented not only the loss of a leader, but the reaffirmation of centuries-old exploitation. Meanwhile, the Shah consolidated his power with American backing. U.S. advisors trained his security forces, modernized military units, and helped establish intelligence networks capable of monitoring dissent. Political opposition was stifled. Newspapers, once instruments of public debate, were now heavily censored, and journalists who opposed the Shah's regime faced imprisonment or exile. The political space Mossadegh had expanded for democracy and civil rights contracted sharply. The population, initially celebrating the end of chaos on the streets, quickly understood that the new stability was enforced through surveillance, fear, and repression. The CIA and MI6, meanwhile, considered the operation a triumph. Internally, the coup became a template for covert intervention during the Cold War. It demonstrated that foreign powers could manipulate political, social, and military structures to achieve objectives without overt warfare. Agents studied every step: the use of propaganda, the strategic employment of paid mobs, the leveraging of clerical influence, the bribery of military officers, and cataloged the lessons for future operations in the developing world. Operation Ajax became a textbook example of plausible deniability, where governments could intervene without formally acknowledging their involvement. Yet the victory came at a cost invisible to the architects. The Iranian people, especially the urban middle class and politically engaged citizens, developed deep and lasting mistrust toward the United States and Britain. What was officially a legitimate transition appeared to them as a betrayal of democracy and sovereignty. Even decades later, the memory of Mossadegh's overthrow would fuel resentment, shaping political discourse, anti-Western sentiment, and revolutionary ideology. The seeds planted in August 1953 would later germinate into the Islamic Revolution of 1979, which dramatically overturned the very structures the CIA and MI6 had reinforced. Internationally, the coup reinforced Cold War assumptions. Eisenhower's administration viewed Operation Ajax as a demonstration of effective containment. Remove nationalist leaders before they drift towards Soviet influence, even if that drift was exaggerated or entirely fabricated. British policymakers saw it as a reclamation of influence, proof that their empire could still manipulate global resources. Both powers, however, underestimated the long-term consequences of interfering in national self-determination. They treated Iran as a chessboard, but they failed to consider that pawns remember. Mossadegh, confined under house arrest, remained a symbol. To the Iranian people, he embodied courage, integrity, and the possibility of resisting external domination. His legalistic, principled approach became a moral touchstone for future generations. Zahedi, for all his obedience to the coup's architects, could never command the same legitimacy. The Shah's restored authority relied entirely on the perception of Western support, a reliance that would eventually expose his vulnerability.
Even today, historians debate the precise scale and mechanics of the CIA's involvement. Documents released decades later revealed the funding of newspapers, payments to street agitators, and coordination with military officers. MI6 files confirmed that Britain orchestrated intelligence networks and provided operational guidance. Yet some details remain classified or obscured, highlighting the degree to which covert action depends on secrecy. Operation Ajax was a success in immediate terms, but its shadows extended far longer than anyone anticipated. Ultimately, the aftermath of Operation Ajax demonstrates a stark lesson in geopolitics. External intervention can achieve tactical goals, but often fails to secure strategic legitimacy. Mossadegh's removal restored Western control over Iranian oil and strengthened the Shah's monarchy temporarily, but it also sowed seeds of deep resentment, ideological radicalization, and political instability. The United States and Britain had won the battle. They had lost, in many ways, the war of perception. Tehran streets, once animated by nationalist pride, would carry the echoes of betrayal for generations. Operation Ajax did not simply remove a prime minister. It reshaped the trajectory of an entire nation. Mossadegh's overthrow became a defining moment in Iranian memory, an enduring symbol of foreign intervention and the fragility of democracy in a geopolitically contested region. While the immediate objectives, restoring Western control over oil, reinforcing the Shah's monarchy, and preventing the spread of Soviet influence had been achieved, the consequences rippled far beyond Tehran's streets. For the Iranian people, the coup represented betrayal on multiple levels. Mossadegh had been a symbol of independence and legal authority. His downfall, orchestrated with the help of foreign powers, undermined the legitimacy of Iran's political institutions. Citizens who had placed faith in democratic processes witnessed a government toppled not by elections, debate, or internal dissent, but through bribery, manipulation, and staged violence. This eroded trust in governance, creating a climate where conspiracy theories, anti-Western sentiment, and radical ideologies could flourish. The Shah, emboldened by foreign backing, consolidated his rule into an increasingly authoritarian monarchy. With the CIA advising his security apparatus, surveillance networks expanded, political dissidents were suppressed, and civil liberties were curtailed. Iran's oil revenue, redirected under Western-influenced agreements, created economic inequalities that fed public frustration. Yet outwardly, the Shah appeared powerful and in control, a veneer of stability masking deep societal tensions. While Operation Ajax had succeeded in tactical terms, it planted seeds of long-term instability that would eventually culminate in the 1979 Islamic Revolution. For the United States, Operation Ajax became an early blueprint for Cold War intervention. It demonstrated the potential of covert action to shape the political realities of other nations without committing to open military conflict. The operation highlighted key methods: psychological warfare, manipulation of public perception, financial inducements, strategic alliances with local elites, and the orchestration of chaos as tools to achieve policy objectives. Eisenhower and the CIA viewed the coup as proof that strategic objectives could be pursued quietly, efficiently, and deniably. This success encouraged similar operations in Guatemala, Congo, and elsewhere, embedding covert action as a central pillar of U.S. foreign policy for decades. Yet the coup also revealed profound ethical and strategic dilemmas. While the immediate threat of Mossadegh allegedly siding with the Soviets was exaggerated, the intervention assumed the right of foreign powers to reshape Iran's political destiny. The short-term victory obscured long-term consequences. Operation Ajax may have strengthened Western control temporarily, but it fueled deep resentment, mistrust, and anti-American sentiment that would echo throughout the Middle East for generations. Strategic gains came at a human cost, destabilizing Iran's political culture and contributing to cycles of repression, rebellion, and revolution. Britain, too, reaped mixed results. The Anglo-Iranian oil company regained financial advantage, but the empire's credibility suffered. The operation revealed the lengths to which Britain would go to defend its interests, and the tactic of collaboration with U.S. intelligence illustrated that Britain's influence was no longer absolute. Dependence on American power marked a shift in post-war geopolitics. London had to share both the execution and the consequences of foreign intervention with Washington. Operation Ajax also shaped global perceptions of democracy. Mossadegh's removal sent a chilling message. Popular sovereignty could be overridden by clandestine operations backed by foreign money and influence. The optics of democracy, elections, constitutions, and parliamentary debate could be rendered meaningless if powerful nations chose to intervene. The lesson was clear. Strategic interests often outweighed moral or legal considerations, particularly during the ideological struggle of the Cold War. Decades later, historians would debate Operation Ajax in classrooms, intelligence briefings, and political think tanks. Classified CIA documents, British intelligence reports, and personal memoirs of agents like Kermit Roosevelt revealed the intricate orchestration of propaganda, bribes, street manipulation, and clerical influence. Yet as details emerged, some elements remained uncertain. Lost papers, destroyed cables, and selective memory among participants. The operation's shadows persisted, as though the very secrecy that enabled success also ensured that full accountability would never come. The streets, the press, the clergy, the army, all instruments of the coup, serve as enduring evidence that democracy, though fragile, leaves a mark on those who defend it. One of the most enduring and insidious aspects of Operation Ajax was the careful orchestration of perception. While tanks and generals were critical, the coup's architects understood that the battlefield of ideas could be even more decisive than streets and buildings. Kermit Roosevelt, MI6 operatives, and their networks treated Tehran like a theater where public opinion could be directed, influenced, and weaponized. Newspapers, clergy, and rumor became instruments as precise as any firearm. Before August 1953, Mossadegh enjoyed broad support in the press. Tehran's newspapers had praised his nationalization of oil and his legalistic approach to governance. His image, a frail but determined leader committed to justice and sovereignty, resonated deeply with citizens. Roosevelt knew that this narrative had to be undermined. Newspapers were systematically approached, editors bribed, and correspondents given carefully prepared stories. Headlines shifted subtly at first, hinting at instability, exaggerating minor missteps, or emphasizing the influence of leftist elements. Gradually, the tone escalated. Mossadegh became authoritarian, indecisive, and sympathetic to communist agendas. These narratives did not need to be true. Repetition was sufficient. In the days before the final coup, the public could no longer distinguish fact from fabrication. Street mobs, too, were instruments of perception. Paid demonstrators were carefully distributed across Tehran, ensuring that chaos appeared spontaneous, politically charged, and widespread. The presence of these crowds convinced neutral citizens that the government had lost its grip. Ordinary people, fearful of unrest or entangled in confusion, were more likely to withdraw support or align with perceived victors. By controlling what the public saw and believed, Roosevelt and MI6 manufactured consent, or at least resignation, to Mossadegh's removal. Clerical influence added a layer of psychological pressure that transcended mere politics. Religious authorities in Tehran wielded moral authority that could validate or delegitimize leadership. key clerics, persuaded through a combination of financial incentive, fear of leftist influence, and strategic framing, issued sermons warning that the prime minister's governance risked the nation's stability and the moral integrity of society. For citizens steeped in religious observance, these messages were potent, giving ethical weight to what otherwise might have been dismissed as political chaos. Public perception shifted. Disorder was no longer only a matter of policy failure, it was a moral imperative to act. This manipulation of perception extended beyond Iran's borders. International newspapers and diplomats were fed exaggerated accounts of Mossadegh's instability and alleged communist sympathies. Western policymakers were primed to view intervention as urgent, necessary, and justified. The Cold War framework amplified these perceptions, creating a global narrative in which the coup could be framed as containment rather than imperialist manipulation. Roosevelt understood the importance of narrative. Control the story, control the outcome. The psychological dimension of the coup was meticulously timed. Each act of chaos, every street clash, every manipulated headline, every sermon reinforced the others. Chaos created fear. Fear created compliance. Compliance created legitimacy for the coup. By the time tanks entered the streets and loyal officers hesitated, public opinion was already a battlefield in which Mossadegh had been slowly defeated. The CIA and MI6 had weaponized belief itself. Even decades later, analysts would study Operation Ajax as a masterclass in psychological warfare. It revealed that military strength, while necessary, is insufficient when public perception dictates legitimacy. By creating confusion, controlling information, and leveraging societal institutions like religion and media, foreign powers could simulate consent and manufacture the appearance of inevitability. Mossadegh's downfall illustrated the vulnerability of a democracy when public perception is manipulated and when leaders rely on law and morality in the face of orchestrated chaos. Yet this manipulation came at a lasting cost. Iranians did not forget the deception. Newspapers that had printed false narratives, clerics who had been compromised, and soldiers who had betrayed loyalty became symbols of distrust. Psychological manipulation created a culture of skepticism toward government and foreign involvement, an undercurrent that would influence politics, revolution, and anti-Western sentiment for generations. The coup demonstrated that even a successful operation could leave enduring scars on a society's collective consciousness. In short, Operation Ajax was not merely an overthrow, it was a psychological operation, a complex choreography of perception, fear, and narrative. The streets and armies were instruments, but the minds of citizens, both in Tehran and around the world, were the ultimate terrain. Success depended on controlling belief as much as controlling territory, a lesson that would shape intelligence operations for decades. Mossadegh's Iran was lost not merely to generals and tanks, but to perception itself.
The overthrow of Mossadegh reverberated far beyond Iran's borders, sending shockwaves through the fragile geopolitical landscape of the early Cold War. In Washington, London, and Moscow, intelligence circles, diplomats, and policymakers watched Tehran's unfolding drama with a mix of triumph, concern, and calculation. Each international actor interpreted the coup through the lens of ideology, national interest, and fear, making Operation Ajax not just an Iranian event, but a global signal in the contest between East and West. In the United States, the coup was hailed as a major victory for Eisenhower's administration. President Eisenhower, Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, and CIA Director Allen Dulles framed the intervention as a necessary action to prevent communist infiltration in the Middle East. Within months, the agency compiled internal reports celebrating the efficacy of coordinated covert operations. analysts highlighted how psychological warfare, bribery of military officers, and manipulation of public opinion could achieve objectives without open conflict. The operation became a case study for future CIA missions, a demonstration of how to combine military pressure, propaganda, and political influence to shape governments while maintaining plausible deniability. Yet even within Washington, some voices expressed unease. Certain officials and commentators warned that undermining a democratically elected leader could have lasting consequences, both morally and strategically. Critics argued that while the operation removed an immediate perceived threat of communism, it reinforced anti-Western sentiment across the region and would tarnish America's image as a supporter of democratic governance. Their warnings would later prove prophetic. The resentment engendered by foreign interference contributed to decades of Iranian distrust toward the United States, shaping policies, public opinion, and revolutionary movements in the decades that followed. In London, the British government interpreted the success as vindication for MI6's strategy. Britain had invested heavily in shaping perceptions, funding propaganda, and maintaining covert networks throughout Tehran. Anglo-Iranian oil company executives returned with renewed confidence that their assets would remain secure. Yet the operation also revealed Britain's growing dependence on the United States. MI6 had orchestrated the groundwork, but the coup's ultimate success required the CIA's resources, personnel, and political leverage. The alliance reinforced Britain's reliance on American power in post-war foreign policy, cementing a partnership that would influence geopolitical interventions for decades. Moscow, meanwhile, reacted with suspicion, frustration, and a measure of disbelief. Soviet intelligence had long monitored Iran's politics, noting Mossadegh's nationalist tendencies, but failing to see a substantial communist threat. When news of the coup reached the Kremlin, the Soviets recognized the operation as both a demonstration of American and British capability, and a warning. Washington and London could orchestrate regime changes in strategic regions, even in countries beyond their direct military control. The coup reinforced Soviet fears of Western interventionism, while illustrating the limits of Moscow's influence in areas where nationalism, rather than communism, dominated public sentiment. Across the globe, governments and citizens observed Tehran's drama with varying reactions. Some viewed it as a triumph of strategic intelligence and geopolitical foresight. Others saw it as a stark example of imperial overreach and manipulation of sovereignty. In the Middle East, the message was clear. External powers could influence domestic politics with subtlety, precision, and deniability. For nationalist movements, the coup was both a cautionary tale and a rallying point, demonstrating the vulnerability of independent governance in a world dominated by superpower interests. The Cold War context framed every interpretation. Operation Ajax was justified, internally and externally, as a preventative action in the global struggle against communism. But it also demonstrated a troubling principle. In a world polarized by ideology, ethical considerations could be subordinated to strategic imperatives. Democracy could be undermined if it conflicted with perceived geopolitical necessity. Sovereignty could be violated if it threatened foreign interests. Mossadegh's overthrow became a symbol of the fragility of smaller nations caught between superpowers, a microcosm of the ideological and strategic battles shaping the mid-20th century. By manipulating perception, controlling military levers, and orchestrating chaos, the CIA and MI6 had demonstrated the efficacy of covert operations in the Cold War era. Yet the operation also sowed seeds of distrust, instability, and enduring resentment. International observers noted the immediate success, but few could foresee the long-term consequences. A nation embittered, a monarchy reinforced artificially, and the foundations for future revolution quietly laid beneath the streets of Tehran. Operation Ajax had succeeded in the short term, but the reverberations of covert intervention would echo for generations in Iran, in the Middle East, and across a world increasingly defined by shadow wars, psychological operations,
and the manipulation of perception.
With Mossadegh removed and General Zahedi installed as prime minister, the Shah's role in Iran shifted from figurehead to central authority, albeit one heavily dependent on foreign backing. Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, emboldened by the successful outcome of Operation Ajax, now faced the dual task of consolidating power while ensuring that neither internal opposition nor foreign suspicion threatened his restored monarchy. The Shah's rule, strengthened by CIA guidance and Western resources, became a complex balancing act between repression, modernization, and the cultivation of legitimacy. Zahedi, though technically prime minister, functioned largely as an intermediary between the Shah and the military. He immediately moved to secure the loyalty of officers who had participated in the coup, rewarding those who had defected with promotions and financial incentives. Units loyal to Mossadegh were purged or reassigned, ensuring that any potential dissent within the military was minimized. The army, which had once hesitated to act against its prime minister, was now firmly aligned with the Shah's objectives. Western advisors, particularly from the CIA, provided strategic guidance, ensuring that military authority remained concentrated and controllable. Beyond the military, the Shah turned to political control. Newspapers were censored or co-opted to reinforce the new order. Editors who had participated in Operation Ajax were rewarded, while journalists who criticized the Shah or questioned the legality of Mossadegh's removal faced imprisonment or exile. This control of information extended to education and public discourse, creating an environment in which dissent was limited and public opinion could be shaped in favor of the monarchy. Over time, the perception of stability became inseparable from the perception of loyalty to the Shah. Economic policy followed a similar pattern. The restructured oil agreements, favoring Western interests, provided the state with financial resources that could be leveraged to strengthen the monarchy's position. Infrastructure projects, modernization initiatives, and selective social programs were promoted as evidence of progress and good governance. Yet these programs often masked systemic inequality, creating pockets of prosperity that reinforced the Shah's image while leaving much of the population disconnected from the benefits. The economic narrative, carefully managed, emphasized growth and modernization while obscuring the reality of dependency on Western capital. The Shah also understood the importance of psychological control. Intelligence networks, established with CIA assistance, monitored political activity, religious figures, and opposition movements. The Savak, Iran's notorious secret police, was empowered to identify, intimidate, or eliminate perceived threats to the monarchy. Fear became an instrument of governance. Citizens learned to navigate public life cautiously, aware that dissent could have immediate consequences. Over time, this climate of surveillance ensured that opposition was fragmented, cautious, and largely underground. Culturally, the Shah sought to present an image of progress and sophistication, positioning Iran as a modern state aligned with Western values. Western advisors, particularly Americans, helped design programs that highlighted education, urban development, and technological advancement. While these efforts did contribute to modernization, they were often superficial and did not address systemic political exclusion or popular grievances. For many Iranians, modernization under the Shah felt imposed rather than organic, an external template enforced at the cost of self-determination. Yet, despite this consolidation of power, cracks remained. Mossadegh's supporters, though politically neutralized, retained moral authority. Intellectuals, clerics, and nationalist leaders quietly nurtured dissent, waiting for opportunities to challenge the Shah's authority. Operation Ajax, while effective in the short term, had created an artificial order,
reliant on coercion, foreign support, and the perception of inevitability. Beneath the surface, resentment simmered, a long-term consequence that would eventually erupt decades later. In essence, the Shah's reign after Operation Ajax exemplified the tension between authority and legitimacy. The monarchy appeared powerful, modernized, and in control, yet its foundations were dependent on manipulation, fear, and foreign support. The events of 1953 shaped the Shah's approach to governance, embedding a reliance on intelligence, military loyalty, and media control as pillars of political survival. The operation that restored his rule had secured immediate objectives, but it also created a political landscape fraught with tension, mistrust, and unresolved grievances, conditions that would later challenge the monarchy's durability and contribute to revolutionary fervor. After his arrest and the collapse of his government, Mohammad Mossadegh entered a period of life that was starkly different from his earlier prominence. Removed from power, isolated from public discourse, and constrained under house arrest, he lived quietly, though never forgotten. Yet even in confinement, Mossadegh's presence loomed large in the Iranian psyche. His final years were marked not by political maneuvering, but by reflection, moral authority, and the enduring symbolic power he had acquired. Initially, the CIA and Zaydis government attempted to neutralize Mossadegh's influence completely. Reports circulated suggesting that he would be forgotten, that his political base would disintegrate, and that his reputation could be tarnished over time. Yet Mossadegh's personal integrity, legalistic approach, and nationalist credentials made him impervious to outright defamation. The people who had followed him during the oil nationalization, who had celebrated him as a defender of Iran's sovereignty, remembered him as more than a politician. He became a moral benchmark. His very restraint, his refusal to condone violence even in the face of betrayal, reinforced his image as principled and incorruptible. House arrest did not silence him entirely. Mossadegh maintained correspondence with intellectuals, journalists, and supporters, expressing his vision for Iran's political future and critiquing the Shah's regime. Though censored and monitored, these communications were sometimes smuggled to sympathetic circles and gradually circulated, creating an underground echo of resistance. Even confined, Mossadegh shaped public discourse indirectly, offering a quiet challenge to the narratives imposed by Operation Ajax. Over time, Mossadegh became a symbol of national sovereignty and resistance against foreign domination. His image, once that of a fragile but determined leader, evolved into a representation of Iranian self-determination. For future generations, he embodied the possibility of challenging both internal tyranny and external interference. Intellectuals, political activists, and even some clerics invoked Mossadegh as a moral exemplar, contrasting his commitment to legality and principle with the Shah's reliance on coercion, foreign support, and fear. His symbolic power grew precisely because he had been removed. Martyrdom, in a sense, amplified his influence. Mossadegh's house arrest was physically restrictive but intellectually unconstrained. He read extensively, reflecting on governance, law, and Iran's position in the modern world. Accounts from visitors describe a man deeply engaged with ideas, committed to dialogue, and unbowed by isolation. The resilience he displayed in these years only strengthened his moral authority. Mossadegh's endurance became a subtle form of resistance, demonstrating that political power may be constrained, but ideas cannot be easily silenced. Internationally, Mossadegh remained a figure of interest. Scholars, journalists, and diplomats debated his removal, its legality, and its implications for global politics. Even as the CIA celebrated Operation Ajax as a triumph, critics highlighted the moral and strategic costs. Mossadegh became a cautionary tale in Western discourse. The the dangers of intervention, the fragility of democracy under external pressure, and the unpredictability of public reaction in geopolitically sensitive regions. To some, he represented a failed experiment. To others, he symbolized the resilience of principle over expedience. In Iran, Mossadegh's symbolic power persisted long after his death in 1967. His house, his writings, and his image became touchstones for nationalist and reformist movements. Every wave of dissent against the Shah, every assertion of sovereignty invoked Mossadegh's legacy. The 1979 Islamic Revolution, which ultimately ousted the monarchy that Operation Ajax had restored, drew on the historical memory of 1953 as a source of moral and political inspiration. In this sense, Mossadegh's influence outlasted the very coup that sought to eliminate him, demonstrating the enduring potency of ideas over orchestrated political power. Mossadegh's final years illustrate a central paradox. Removal from office and physical isolation could not diminish his moral and symbolic authority. While Operation Ajax achieved immediate objectives, restoring foreign influence and consolidating the Shah's rule, it could not erase the ideals, legitimacy, and inspiration embodied by Iran's deposed leader. In the end, Mossadegh's life under house arrest reinforced a broader truth about history. Political power may shift in the short term, but principles, integrity, and the memory of resistance endure far longer than the schemes of intelligence agencies or governments. Operation Ajax is often cited as one of the most significant early examples of Cold War covert action, a case study in how intelligence agencies can manipulate political systems, social perception, and national institutions to achieve strategic objectives. The operation's success, in terms of immediate results, demonstrated the potential of psychological warfare, propaganda, and targeted bribery. Yet, as subsequent decades have revealed, its lessons extend far beyond the tactical realm, offering a cautionary framework for modern intelligence operations. One of the most critical lessons is the power of perception over reality. Roosevelt, MI6, and their collaborators recognized that controlling the narrative, what citizens believed about Mossadegh, his government, and the stability of the nation, was as important as controlling the streets. By bribing journalists, orchestrating riots, and pressuring religious authorities, they shaped public understanding of events before physical actions took place. This manipulation highlights a principle that remains relevant today. Perception is a battlefield, and influencing what people believe can be as decisive as military engagement. The operation also emphasized the importance of local intermediaries and cultural knowledge. Foreign agents did not act alone. They relied on sympathetic officers, clerics, journalists, and even street thugs who understood Tehran's political and social dynamics. Intelligence operations must account for local hierarchies, religious influence, and cultural norms. Failure to engage these elements can render even well-funded interventions ineffective. The first failed attempt of August 15, 1953, demonstrates that ignoring these subtleties can lead to disaster. Only when Roosevelt aligned local actors with his strategy did the coup succeed. Another key takeaway is the integration of multiple levers of influence. Operation Ajax combined propaganda, economic manipulation, psychological pressure, military intervention, and political legalism. Each element reinforced the others. Street chaos created fear that amplified media narratives. Military defection gained legitimacy through the Shah's decrees. Clerical endorsement lent moral authority. The operation illustrates the effectiveness of multidimensional strategies, where no single approach suffices, and coordination across intelligence, political, and social spheres is essential. However, Ajax also teaches lessons about strategic risk and long-term consequences. While the immediate goals were achieved, Mossadegh removed, the Shah restored, Western control of oil secured, the coup sowed enduring resentment, mistrust, and political instability. For modern intelligence agencies, this demonstrates that short-term tactical victories can have profound long-term costs. Covert action may achieve immediate objectives, but it can also generate enduring backlash, shaping international relations, domestic politics, and public sentiment for generations. The operation further underscores the necessity of plausible deniability. Both the CIA and MI6 ensured that their involvement remained officially deniable. Agents avoided overt violence, relied on intermediaries, and masked financial transactions through complex networks. This approach not only protected foreign governments from direct accountability, but also allowed the narrative of legality and legitimacy to be maintained domestically. In modern operations, maintaining the appearance of autonomy or legitimacy can be as important as operational effectiveness itself. Ethics also emerge as a central consideration. Operation Ajax demonstrates the moral complexity of intervention. Agents and policymakers justified their actions under Cold War imperatives, claiming that preventing communism justified undermining democracy. Yet the human, cultural, and political costs were immense. Civilians endured orchestrated chaos, a democratically elected leader was imprisoned, and Iran's long-term political trajectory was altered. Modern intelligence agencies must grapple with similar ethical dilemmas. Effectiveness does not absolve the moral consequences of intervention. Finally, Ajax highlights the resilience of political ideas. Despite Mossadegh's removal, his ideals endured. He became a symbol of national sovereignty, moral leadership, and resistance to foreign interference. Intelligence agencies can manipulate institutions, perception, and events, but they cannot erase principles or public memory. Long-term influence often depends not on coercion, but on legitimacy, values, and credibility, lessons that remain essential for any modern strategist. Operation Ajax, in sum, is both a blueprint and a warning. It demonstrates how coordinated, multifaceted covert action can achieve immediate objectives, but also how manipulation, foreign intervention, and disregard for local legitimacy can sow enduring instability. For contemporary intelligence, the operation offers tactical insights, ethical challenges, and historical context. Power may be seized, narratives may be controlled, and governments may be toppled, but the consequences echo far beyond the moment, shaping nations and perceptions for generations.
The story of Operation Ajax remained shrouded in secrecy for decades. For years, both the CIA and MI6 officially denied involvement, framing Mossadegh's removal as an internal Iranian political realignment. Even in Washington and London, knowledge of the operation was restricted to a small circle of intelligence officers and policymakers. Public awareness was limited, leaving historians, journalists, and scholars to piece together the narrative from fragmentary sources, whispers, and later released documents. It wasn't until declassified archives in the 1970s and 2000s that the full scope of the coup, the orchestration of riots, bribery of officers, manipulation of clergy, and psychological warfare, became widely acknowledged. Historical scholarship has approached Operation Ajax from multiple perspectives, each emphasizing different aspects of the event. Political historians focus on the mechanics of Mossadegh's overthrow, highlighting the interplay between domestic factions, military betrayal, and royal authority. They examine how Zayedi's appointment, the Shah's compliance, and the manipulation of democratic institutions created the illusion of legality. These studies emphasize the sophistication of planning, the meticulous coordination between CIA and MI6, and the role of timing and perception in determining success. Intelligence historians analyze Ajax as a blueprint for Cold War covert operations. Kermit Roosevelt's memoirs, CIA internal reports, and MI6 correspondence revealed the complexity of modern espionage, the use of clandestine financial flows, orchestrated propaganda, and psychological operations. Ajax demonstrates that effective covert action relies on multi-layered influence, controlling perception, co-opting elites, and shaping events without direct attribution. Scholars note that while the operation achieved tactical success, it also illustrates inherent vulnerabilities, exposure risks, reliance on intermediaries, and unintended consequences. Economic historians examine the coup through the prism of resource control and national sovereignty. Mossadegh's nationalization of Iranian oil threatened British and American interests, and Ajax restored Western access to petroleum resources under favorable terms. Analyses reveal the intertwined nature of economic and political objectives in Cold War interventions. Operation Ajax is often cited as a case in which strategic economic interests justified the orchestration of political manipulation and regime change, highlighting the intersection of global capitalism and covert action. In Iran, the memory of Ajax is politically potent. Mossadegh is celebrated as a nationalist hero, a martyr for democracy, and a symbol of resistance to imperialism. The coup is frequently invoked in discussions of sovereignty, foreign intervention, and national pride. Politicians, intellectuals, and educators reference 1953 to highlight the dangers of external influence and the fragility of domestic institutions. It is not merely historical curiosity, it is a foundational story in the modern Iranian political consciousness. Globally, Ajax has informed debates about ethics in intelligence and intervention. Critics argue that the operation exemplifies the dangers of prioritizing strategic objectives over democratic legitimacy and human cost. Advocates point to the Cold War context, asserting that geopolitical imperatives, particularly the perceived threat of Soviet influence, demanded decisive action. Modern intelligence agencies continue to study Ajax as a cautionary tale, balancing tactical success with moral and strategic consequences. It remains a touchstone in courses on intelligence, international relations, and political strategy. Ultimately, Operation Ajax occupies a dual space in history. It is both a technical achievement in covert operations and a symbol of the profound consequences of foreign interference. Scholars agree that the event reshaped Iran, altered U.S. and British approaches to intelligence, and influenced global Cold War dynamics, yet they also recognize its enduring complexity. Success in the immediate term did not translate to legitimacy or long-term stability. The operation is remembered not only for what it accomplished, but for the shadows it left, shadows that continue to shape politics, scholarship, and public memory decades later.
The consequences of Operation Ajax extended far beyond Iran's borders, reshaping political calculations, alliances, and popular perceptions across the Middle East. Governments, movements, and intelligence agencies alike observed the events in Tehran closely, extracting lessons about both the potential and dangers of foreign intervention. While the immediate focus was on Iran, the operation sent ripples that influenced regional dynamics for decades. One immediate consequence was the demonstration effect. Arab and Middle Eastern leaders, witnessing the success of a Western-engineered coup, recognized that their own nations could be vulnerable to similar manipulations. This awareness produced two competing responses. On one hand, pro-Western regimes saw value in cooperation with the United States and Britain, reinforcing alliances through loyalty, economic concessions, and strategic alignment. On the other, nationalist and anti-imperialist movements viewed the coup as a warning. Independence and resistance could be punished by covert intervention, destabilization, or regime change. The sense of vulnerability heightened political anxiety and altered domestic strategies across the region. Nationalist movements, in particular, were deeply influenced. Leaders in Egypt, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon analyzed Mossadegh's downfall, noting both the strengths and weaknesses of his approach. While Mossadegh's commitment to nationalization and sovereignty resonated, his lack of control over military loyalty and urban unrest highlighted critical vulnerabilities. Activists concluded that popular support alone was insufficient against foreign power and internal betrayal. The coup became a case study in balancing ideology, governance, and the practicalities of survival under global pressure. The ripple effects also extended to foreign policy and intelligence doctrine. Middle Eastern governments began investing heavily in intelligence networks, both domestic and foreign, to monitor internal dissent and potential foreign influence. Leaders recognized that in an era of Cold War competition, covert action was a tool that could topple governments with little warning. Regional militaries were professionalized, surveillance expanded, and loyalty networks tightened as lessons from Tehran underscored the fragility of political control when faced with external interference. Economically, Operation Ajax reaffirmed the strategic importance of oil in the Middle East. The operation demonstrated that foreign powers were willing to orchestrate political upheaval to protect resource interests. Governments began to calculate the political risks of nationalization and economic independence, weighing sovereignty against the potential consequences of antagonizing Western powers. For both established monarchies and emerging republics, the lesson was clear. Oil was not merely an economic commodity, but a geopolitical lever with profound political implications. Culturally, the operation influenced public perception of the West. Across the region, journalists, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens came to view foreign powers with heightened suspicion. The narrative of manipulated elections, street riots, and coerced political transitions fueled anti-imperialist discourse. Mossadegh's experience became emblematic of the dangers of Western interference, a cautionary tale repeated in newspapers, political speeches, and academic discussions. For regional populations, Tehran was proof that sovereignty could be undermined subtly through coordination, manipulation, and covert resources. The United States, while celebrating the success of Ajax internally, soon faced unintended consequences. Anti-American sentiment in the Middle East intensified, complicating diplomatic relationships and fueling suspicion toward U.S. motives in other nations. The CIA's model of covert action became both admired and feared, creating an image of American influence as both powerful and intrusive. While operational goals were achieved, the reputational cost created long-term challenges for diplomacy, alliance building, and soft power in the region. Finally, the operation set a precedent for both intervention and resistance. Governments and opposition movements recognized the duality of covert power. It could enforce compliance or provoke a backlash. The coup underscored the importance of legitimacy, public perception, and military loyalty, not just external support, in sustaining political authority. Across the Middle East, these lessons informed the strategies of both authoritarian regimes and revolutionary movements, shaping the balance between domestic stability and foreign influence for decades to come. Operation Ajax, in this context, was more than an Iranian event. It became a regional catalyst, a touchstone for understanding the vulnerabilities of sovereignty in the Cold War era. The lessons learned in propaganda, psychological operations, military defection, and resource leverage would echo in the policies of neighboring states and influence the trajectory of the Middle East long after the streets of Tehran had quieted. Mossadegh's removal was not merely a national crisis. It was a global warning about the reach and consequences of covert power. The repercussions of Operation Ajax extended far beyond Iran's immediate political upheaval, shaping not only regional dynamics but also global Cold War strategy. The coup demonstrated that carefully orchestrated covert operations could decisively alter a nation's political trajectory without open warfare, a lesson that Washington, London, and other capitals internalized with both excitement and caution. Yet as the years passed, it became clear that the intervention produced consequences far more complex than the architects had anticipated. For the United States, Ajax became a cornerstone of Cold War doctrine. The CIA's success validated the use of clandestine operations to contain perceived communist threats, reinforcing the belief that intelligence, propaganda, and strategic manipulation could achieve outcomes faster and more quietly than conventional military action. Subsequent interventions in Latin America, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East drew heavily on the Ajax template, emphasizing psychological operations, media influence, and coordination with local actors. The operation became both a model and a warning. When executed properly, covert action could shape geopolitics, but missteps could ignite enduring instability. The Shah's strengthened rule in Iran had immediate benefits for Western powers, especially concerning oil and strategic influence. Iran became a stable ally in a volatile region, serving as a bulwark against Soviet expansion and a critical node in the network of Western-aligned Middle Eastern states. Yet this stability came at a cost. The Iranian population increasingly associated the monarchy with foreign manipulation, a perception that fueled resentment, nationalism, and ultimately revolutionary sentiment. The seeds of the 1979 Islamic Revolution were in many ways sown by the very operation that restored the Shah, illustrating the long-term perils of short-term geopolitical gains. Regionally, Ajax altered calculations for neighboring states. Arab and Middle Eastern leaders observed Tehran with a mix of admiration and fear. Pro-Western monarchies reinforced loyalty, increased intelligence capabilities, and strengthened military hierarchies to preempt similar interventions. Conversely, nationalist and revolutionary movements learned that foreign powers could rapidly undermine domestic sovereignty. Leaders in Egypt, Iraq, and Syria noted that Mossadegh's combination of democratic legitimacy and resource control was insufficient against coordinated external pressure, influencing how they balanced popular legitimacy with centralized control. The coup also reshaped perceptions of U.S. and British power globally. Washington and London projected an image of operational sophistication capable of directing events behind the scenes. Yet this power came with reputational costs. The perception of imperial overreach and manipulation damaged diplomatic credibility, creating long-term skepticism of Western intentions. Mossadegh became a symbol not only of Iran's lost sovereignty, but also of the broader vulnerabilities faced by nations navigating Cold War geopolitics. Foreign intervention was effective tactically, but it reinforced the idea that Western influence could be both pervasive and coercive. Operation Ajax highlighted a broader geopolitical principle. Short-term tactical victories do not guarantee long-term stability. The operation achieved immediate objectives, removing Mossadegh, restoring the Shah, and securing oil interests, but it also destabilized Iran's internal political culture. Political institutions were weakened, public trust was eroded, and civic memory retained the trauma of manipulation. These long-term effects complicated U.S. and British strategic goals in the Middle East, illustrating that the immediate success of covert action often masks downstream vulnerabilities. The psychological dimension of Ajax had lasting implications for international politics. By demonstrating the efficacy of manipulating perception, the coup underscored the importance of information in global strategy. Media influence, propaganda, and the orchestration of social unrest became central tools for states seeking to project power without open conflict. This principle guided countless subsequent operations, making Ajax a seminal case study in the evolving art of modern intelligence, political warfare, and global influence. Finally, the operation exposed a paradox in international relations. Nations could gain immediate strategic advantages while simultaneously sowing the seeds of future resistance. Iran's resentment of Western intervention fueled nationalist, anti-imperialist, and revolutionary movements that would later challenge U.S. and British policies in the Middle East. Mossadegh's legacy endured as a reminder that coercion and manipulation, while effective in the short term, cannot fully suppress the political and moral forces embedded within a society. In this sense, Operation Ajax was both a triumph and a cautionary tale. It demonstrated the power of covert action to reshape political outcomes, but it also revealed the fragility of imposed authority, the persistence of popular memory, and the enduring consequences of intervention. The coup's reverberations shaped the Middle East, U.S. intelligence doctrine, and global geopolitics for decades, leaving an indelible mark on history that continues to inform policy, scholarship, and collective memory.
In the aftermath of Operation Ajax, both the CIA and MI6 engaged in extensive internal review, examining the operation's successes, shortcomings, and implications for future covert activities. For both agencies, the Iranian coup represented not only a tactical victory, but also a learning experience that would influence intelligence operations for decades. Meetings, reports, and classified debriefings sought to codify lessons on the interplay of perception, local actors, and operational coordination, lessons that would become foundational for Cold War-era covert policy. Within the CIA, Kermit Roosevelt's field reports were circulated among senior leadership as exemplary case studies. Analysts praised the integration of multiple operational levers: military coordination, political manipulation, media control, and public perception. Roosevelt's ability to orchestrate defection among key officers, exploit clerical influence, and direct staged street protests became a blueprint for future missions. Internal memoranda emphasized the importance of timing, demonstrating that even a well-resourced operation could fail if coordination faltered or if actors on the ground resisted manipulation. The failed initial coup attempt on August 15, 1953, was dissected in detail, highlighting the risks of miscommunication, misjudged loyalty, and insufficient crowd control. MI6 approached the coup with a slightly different lens, emphasizing the value of local intelligence networks, social leverage, and financial influence. British operatives took pride in the careful groundwork laid over months, including the identification of sympathetic generals, the cultivation of clerical support, and the strategic deployment of bribes. MI6 assessments stressed that success depended on subtlety. The appearance of internal legitimacy was as important as the operational outcome itself. British intelligence also noted the necessity of coordination with allies, in this case the CIA, underscoring that joint operations required rigorous communication and shared objectives to succeed. Yet, both agencies were acutely aware of the operation's ethical and reputational dimensions. Internal CIA documents contain reflections on the moral ambiguity of orchestrating regime change in a sovereign nation. While official narratives framed Ajax as a necessary measure to contain communism and protect strategic interests, analysts privately recognized that undermining a democratically elected leader carried risks of long-term backlash. MI6 similarly noted that public perception, if it shifted, could tarnish Britain's image in ways that extended beyond immediate operational goals. These reflections would inform the agency's approach to deniable operations in future conflicts, balancing efficacy with the risks of exposure and public criticism. Financial oversight and operational logistics were another point of reflection. Both agencies examined the allocation of funds for bribery, propaganda, and street mobilization, assessing efficiency and the effectiveness of incentives. The strategic deployment of cash, ostensibly for spontaneous civilian activity, proved decisive in manipulating events on the streets. Lessons learned included the importance of discrete financial networks, the management of intermediaries, and contingency planning to ensure that funds reached intended recipients without exposure. These logistical insights became critical for subsequent covert operations worldwide. Psychological and informational strategies received particular attention. Analysts noted that perception management, controlling media narratives, shaping religious opinion, and creating the illusion of public spontaneity had been as decisive as military or political maneuvers. Both the CIA and MI6 identified Ajax as a case study in modern psychological operations, illustrating how information could be weaponized to simulate legitimacy, erode resistance, and amplify fear or uncertainty. This approach would inform the burgeoning field of strategic communication, propaganda, and influence operations in the Cold War era. Finally, Operation Ajax prompted broader institutional reflection on the limits of covert action. Both agencies acknowledged that while short-term goals could be achieved, long-term political consequences were unpredictable. Analysts debated the sustainability of foreign-imposed stability, noting that resentment, nationalist movements, and historical memory could undermine even the most meticulously planned interventions. These reflections would later temper, but never fully restrain, U.S. and British engagement in regime change operations elsewhere, demonstrating the tension between operational confidence and strategic caution. In sum, the CIA and MI6 treated Operation Ajax as both a triumph and a teacher. It confirmed the effectiveness of coordinated, multidimensional covert action while exposing the moral, logistical, and strategic challenges inherent in such endeavors. The lessons drawn from Tehran shaped Cold War intelligence doctrine, informing both the methods and the mindset of covert agencies for decades. Ajax would remain internally a benchmark for what could be achieved when strategy, psychology, and meticulous planning converged, and a cautionary reminder of the enduring consequences of manipulating sovereignty and perception.
Operation Ajax stands as one of the most consequential covert operations of the 20th century, a moment when intelligence, politics, and psychology converged to reshape a nation and influence global history. Its immediate success, the removal of Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, the restoration of the Shah, and the securing of Western oil interests, masked the enduring complexities that the operation would leave in its wake. The coup offers a window into the mechanisms of covert power, the limits of control, and the long-term consequences of intervention, lessons that continue to resonate in both historical scholarship and contemporary intelligence practice. From a tactical perspective, Ajax exemplifies the efficacy of a multidimensional approach. Military defection, bribery, media manipulation, and psychological operations were orchestrated in unison, demonstrating that modern intelligence operations require more than force or resources alone. The orchestration of public perception, a carefully choreographed blend of propaganda, clerical influence, and staged civil unrest, was as crucial to success as tanks or generals. The operation codifies strategies that would inform Cold War interventions globally, providing the template for the integration of covert action with political and social engineering. Yet, Ajax also illustrates the fragility of imposed authority. The Shah's regime, though consolidated with American and British support, rested on external validation and fear rather than popular legitimacy. While effective in the short term, this foundation proved inherently unstable. Mossadegh's legacy endured, symbolizing integrity, nationalism, and resistance. The moral and ideological resonance of his removal created enduring anti-Western sentiment, nationalist mobilization, and political consciousness that ultimately contributed to the Islamic Revolution of 1979. In other words, operational success did not translate into sustainable stability or legitimacy. The coup also underscores the moral and ethical dimensions of intervention. Agents and policymakers justified the operation through Cold War imperatives, the prevention of communist expansion, and the protection of strategic interests. Yet the human cost, the manipulation of citizens, the imprisonment of a democratically elected leader, and the artificial restructuring of a nation's political system raises enduring questions about the limits of covert power. Operation Ajax reminds historians and strategists alike that historical victories are inseparable from their ethical ramifications, and that the consequences of manipulating sovereignty reverberate far beyond immediate objectives. From a historical and scholarly perspective, Ajax is a focal point for debates about imperialism, sovereignty, and the role of foreign influence in domestic politics. Historians examine the operation not only as a case study in intelligence craft, but as a lesson in geopolitical consequences. Economists, political scientists, and cultural historians alike analyze the coup's effect on Iran's political institutions, social trust, and regional dynamics. The event is a touchstone for understanding the interplay between resources, ideology, and international power, illustrating that the removal of a single leader can reverberate across decades and continents. The operation's broader implications for the Middle East are equally significant. Regional governments, nationalist movements, and foreign powers all observed the events in Tehran, learning lessons about vulnerability, loyalty, and perception management. The coup became a reference point for understanding both the utility and danger of foreign intervention, influencing political calculations, intelligence strategies, and popular narratives throughout the region. Its legacy shaped diplomatic relations, resistance movements, and the psychology of governance in countries navigating the pressures of Cold War geopolitics. Ultimately, Operation Ajax embodies both the power and the peril of covert action. It demonstrates that intelligence operations can decisively shape political outcomes, manipulate perception, and secure strategic advantage. Yet, it also reveals that human memory, national identity, and moral authority cannot be fully controlled. Mossadegh's enduring symbolism, the resentment toward foreign interference, and the eventual overthrow of the Shah all attest to the limits of imposed power. Ajax, therefore, is both a triumph and a cautionary tale, illustrating that history is shaped as much by ideas and legitimacy as by strategy and force. As modern scholars, policymakers, and intelligence professionals reflect on Operation Ajax, the lessons are clear. Tactical victories are only part of the equation. The long-term consequences of intervention are profound, unpredictable, and often enduring. The operation's legacy endures not merely in the annals of intelligence history, but in the lived experience, collective memory, and political consciousness of a nation, and in the enduring reminder that covert power, while potent, is never absolute.
We've traced the shadows of Tehran's streets, followed the whispered corridors of intelligence agencies, and lingered in the tense silence of house arrest, with a man whose ideals outlasted the guns, the bribes, and the propaganda. Operation Ajax was more than a coup. It was a masterclass in perception, power, and the profound consequences of meddling in another nation's destiny. But it was also a reminder, perhaps the most important one, that even the most meticulously executed plans cannot control the hearts, memories, and resilience of people. Mossadegh may have been removed from office, but not from history. His legacy, etched into the Iranian psyche and echoed across the Middle East, reminds us that democracy, sovereignty, and principle can survive even in the shadow of covert power. And the Shah, bolstered by foreign support, ruled with strength but could never fully command loyalty born of legitimacy rather than fear. As we close tonight's chapter, remember this: behind every headline, every riot, and every strategic maneuver lies the human cost, the lives, the choices, and the ideals that persist long after the cameras leave and the streets fall silent. Operation Ajax is more than a historical event. It is a cautionary tale, a mirror reflecting the limits of influence and the unpredictable persistence of truth. So wherever you are in the world, and whatever hour it may be, let this story linger. Think about the forces that shape nations unseen, the decisions made in secret rooms, and the people who endure the consequences. History is not only written by victors, it is remembered by those who survive it. And sometimes
Those memories echo louder than any propaganda. Thank you for staying awake with us tonight, for stepping into the shadows, and for walking through a history that is stranger, darker, and more consequential than fiction. Until next time, keep watching, keep questioning, and keep thinking. Because in the world of sleepless politics, the night is long, but understanding is worth it.